Chapter 7. The sun was close to completing its climb behind the clouds when the group emerged from the grove. They found themselves standing on the edge of a grassy field overlooking a vast area of flattened earth. "Them's the fields," Token pointed. "Trust me, you're going to get sick of seeing them real quick." Trudging along a gravel road that wound its way down the slope, Vivian saw an old shack slumped like a shipwreck on the edge of a black sea. The structure was house-shaped, but that was the kindest thing Vivian could have said about it. It was jumbled together with several different building materials. One section was made entirely of faded weatherboard, while another was fully brick. A third section jutted out from the side and was more of a tent, its wooden frame visible through sheets of clear plastic. A thin metal chimney poked from the corrugated iron roof like a periscope, lazy trails of smoke curling from its pipe. "Someone lives in that?" Vivian asked incredulously. Lewis hocked and spat a gob of phlegm in the direction of the shack. "Yeah," he said, wiping his mouth. "And trust me, the owner is just as ugly." As they grew nearer, Vivian saw the fields were not actually flat, but tilled with row upon row of green tufts sprouting out of the rich, black soil. An old wood heap sat to one side of the shack, the stacked row of timber blocks grey with age and slowly succumbing to a blanket of deep green moss. Vivian looked for the axe that the dean had mentioned and saw it nearby. The wedge-shaped head was lodged deep in an ancient tree stump, silver strings of spiders' webs hanging from its handle. Vivian frowned at the marble orange and brown coating of rust on the blade and wondered how long it had remained there without being used. He was suddenly reminded of a book he had read about boy Arthur and the sword and the stone. "See over there?" Token pointed past the heap. "That's what we be doing more often than not." Vivian followed the finger and saw at least 30 kids bending or squatting over the rows, hard at work despite the miserable weather. Token led them along the edge of the clearing skirting the nearest field. "So this is what Gorgon meant," Vivian said with a shake of his head. "These are the real-world skills that we learn." "Real-world skills, my black ass," Token grumbled. "Probably just the same lame excuses prisons use to save a buck." Lewis kicked an empty bottle out of his path. "We plow, we weed, we harvest, and after we harvest, we plant more vegetables," he explained. "And it happens all year round. That's why us older and stronger kids usually get sitting down here." He kissed his scrawny bicep. "It sucks, though. You get tired, sore, and real dirty." Vivian had already noticed the dark stains on the knees of each of his new friends, and he now saw dirty smudges on their palms and elbows as well. "You guys were down here this morning?" he asked. Token nodded. "Until 11. Then we headed up to collect you. So you knew I was coming." "Gorgon told us last night," the dark boy said, then turned and gave Vivian a hard look. "Don't go pissing in his pool too much, by the way. The wardens ain't soft like school teachers, so try to play it cool next time you see him." Vivian didn't answer this, partially because he had every intention of pissing in the dean's pool, as Token put it. He scanned the fields looking for fences or other forms of confinement, but saw none. "I don't get it," he said. "What's stopping us just sneaking off like King back there?" Token shook his head. "King's taking a stupid risk. If Mallory catches him, he's history." "If who catches him?" "The groundskeeper," Lewis warned. "He's real bad news. He don't hold back just because you're a kid. One time with Tank, he—" "Shut up!" Tank snarled with such force that Lewis's jaw clamped like a spring trap. The group stopped and looked warily back at the big boy, giving him plenty of space as he plodded past them. He glared at Lewis, small clouds of winter vapor trailing from his mouth like a dragon with a belly full of fire. "Sorry, man, I was just—" Lewis called out, but Tank cut him off. "Always talking, just like a little dog yapping. You just can't shut your mouth, can you?" He moved ahead, muttering to himself and readjusting the bag across his shoulders. "Not smart, man." Token patted Lewis's shoulder. Lewis shoved his hands into his pockets. "God damn it," he sulked. "I didn't mean it. You know I didn't." Token just shook his head and turned his attention back to Vivian. "Anyway, what we're saying is we work hard and we don't mess with the wardens." "Wardens?" Vivian raised an eyebrow. "The adults, cobweb!" Tank shouted over his shoulder, obviously not out of earshot. "So Mallory's one of the wardens," Vivian said. "Yeah, and he the worst one," Token replied. "Then there's Gorgon, you already met him, Corbin, Tyrell, and Maud, and they all be as bad as each other." Vivian scanned the many stooped or crouching figures until he stopped on a tall, coffee-skinned girl in cargos and a tank top who was straightening up and adjusting her black ponytail. Even at a distance, it was obvious to him how pretty she was. "Who's that?" he said, squinting approvingly. "Leona," came the chorus reply from all three boys. "Leona's the queen bee around here," Lewis added. "More like a big sister since she's the oldest girl," Token said. "All the girls here listen to her." "More like a warrior queen," Tank muttered in the distance. And she hates boys, so forget it. The girl arched and stretched, then wiped her hands against the pockets of her cargoes. She looked over and glowered at the boys, who all, except Vivian, turned away. She talks to Token because his little sister is under her protection, Lewis said over his shoulder. But if it's any other guy, she'd probably break their nose. Vivian looked at Token. You have a little sister staying here? Before Token could answer, Tank slid Vivian's duffel off his shoulders with an irritated huff. Enough with the show and tell, cobweb, he growled. We stay here any longer and Mallory will catch us. Didn't take you for the cowardly type, Tiny, Vivian called back, returning his attention to the girl in the field. You're dead, Cobweb. With a grunt, Tank heaved the bag at Vivian, who heard the familiar rattle as it left the boy's hands. He jumped to the side without looking, but the bag fell like a block of cement landing at his feet. Tank charged toward Vivian, head lowered like a bull, and Vivian pounced on the bag. He yanked the zip, praying it wouldn't catch, and tugged out the elongated teardrop of polished, reddish-brown timber. Sensing the big boy above him, Vivian spun and swung the heavy length upward. It resisted the swing at first, feeling as if he was pulling it through water, and Vivian's wrist gave a shriek of strain. But then, carried by momentum, it increased speed. Tank was already well inside the arc, and it was only by jerking his head back and turning it to the side did the barrel of the baseball bat miss his wide chin. His body twisted and he lost balance. He staggered, overshooting his mark by several feet, and fell face down in the dead grass at the edge of the field. Relief flooded through Vivian as he straightened. Rolling his sore hand, he walked over to where Tank had fallen. The big boy had rolled onto his back and was furiously wiping brown grass clippings out of his eyes. Vivian stood over him, pointing the cap of the bat down at the boy's crimson face. Are we done, Tiny? He said calmly. Tank's eyes crossed inward toward the cap. Where did that come from? It's pretty much a part of me. Vivian grinned. Now, are we done? Tank bared his teeth. You got lucky, Cobweb, that's all. Maybe. Vivian narrowed his eyes in warning. Want to find out for sure? Rabbits! A voice as coarse as volcanic rock gurgled behind him. Vivian noticed Token and Lewis stiffen at the sound. Fighting rabbits! The voice jeered in a thick accent that made Vivian think of Russian villains from old James Bond movies. The fire went out of Tank's glare, and he seemed to forget about both Vivian and the bat. The big boy lurched upward several times, trying unsuccessfully to get to his feet, looking more like a fish flopping about. He quickly came to his senses, however, and rolled onto his stomach, pushing himself up into a crouch. A large shadow fell across Vivian, and he felt the familiar shiver that came with being watched from behind. He guessed that this intruder was the groundskeeper the other boys were talking about, and as such wanted them to know that he wasn't going to be intimidated. Without a backward glance, he made a show of casually feeding the bat back into the open mouth of his duffel bag. It was sacred to him after all, and he didn't want it confiscated. Only after he was done did he turn to face the newcomer. He found himself staring at a brass belt buckle. The belt was looped around the waist of a long grey overcoat that looked old, prickly and moth-eaten. Vivian's eyes kept climbing, and he saw small red tags on the shoulders and collar of the coat. He couldn't see what was on them, but got the feeling they were once military tags of some sort, maybe depicting rank or unit. Tilting his head upward, Vivian saw a mop of tangled iron-grey curls framing a long, dirt-stained face. Wild eyes rolled under bushy eyebrows, and rotted teeth almost projected from a grinning mouth. Vivian shuffled back several steps to take in more of the shaggy shape. The man was taller than anyone he had ever seen. Hair and beard snarled together to create a feral visage more akin to an animal than a human. So you'll come back, eh? The man sneered. You think Mallory not notice you rabbits leaving his fields early? Token raised his head and stepped forward stiffly to answer. Vivian could sense the boy's anxiety, but knew from experience that a good leader always protected his group. This is Vivian, Mr. Mallory, the dark boy began. The Dean told us yesterday that he'd be arriving today and that we had to show him around. Mr. Mallory's eyes softened almost sympathetically, but more teeth showed now. He wiped a hairy hand against the stained lapels of his overcoat. Maybe Gorgon ask you, but you not ask Mallory, Black Rabbit, he whispered menacingly and reached out toward Token with one impossibly long arm. Sensing something awful was about to happen, Vivian glanced at the other two boys. Lewis's lip was curled back like a snarling dog's, and his fists were clenched, but he wasn't making any moves to intervene. Tank had completely turned away from Mallory, putting his back to the groundskeeper the way someone warms himself at a bonfire. The look on the big boy's face was distant, his cheeks were flushed, and his eyelids fluttered in an odd way. He seemed to Vivian to be in some sort of fearful trance. They're not going to get involved, he thought with amazement. Why are they so afraid of this guy? He suddenly saw an opportunity to prove his worth to the pack. Their leader was in trouble, and a good second always stepped in and took the heat if they could. It was sacrifice that secured trust. It built friendship. "Hey, Rasputin," he blurted, pulling the name from an old Boney M song he had once heard. "Didn't you hear what he said? Gorgon asked him to show me around. And he is Dean, right?" He stepped up beside Token. "You got a problem with that, then you should go talk to him." The eyes of the warden rolled in their sockets toward him. "A new rabbit," the voice gurgled. "A noisy rabbit." "He doesn't know the rules yet," Token cut in, trying to pull Mallory's attention back. "But he's a good kid, a good worker. A dirt-stained hand the size of a catcher's mitt jammed over Token's face. His words were reduced to a panicked squawk, and Vivian saw his one blue eye staring out from between Mallory's fingers. The warden, now completely focused on Vivian, leaned down for a closer look. He pressed his grizzled face so close to Vivian that the boy took a step back, repelled by the powerful mix of body sweat and what smelled like methylated spirits wafting from the man's mouth. "Mallory will help you understand how things are now, noisy rabbit," the warden said, looking into Vivian's eyes. He gestured behind him across the flats with his other hand. "These are Mallory's fields, and children who work in them are his rabbits. If rabbits work hard and good, then Mallory is good to them. But if rabbits are lazy and bad," he wiped at a foamy line of saliva trailing from the corner of his mouth, "then they are only good for skinning and eating." He looked past Vivian to Tank, standing nearby like a stone statue. "Biggie over there knows what I am talking about." Tank gave a shudder, but did not answer or turn around. Mallory released Token's face, leaving a muddy handprint of black soil on the dark boy's cheek. The warden straightened, and seeming to forget Vivian for the moment, trudged up behind Tank's hunched frame. Token, meanwhile, wiped his face in disgust and gave Mallory's back the finger. Unaware, the groundskeeper circled Tank, the leather of his long boots creaking, the wooden soles squelching in the grass. Tank was big and solid as a bull, but he flinched as Mr. Mallory leaned in over his shoulder like a vulture inspecting a dying meal. "Don't you, piggy?" The man grinned down at the boy, obviously savouring the effect he was having. "You know what it is like to be skinned." Vivian saw Tank's lip begin to tremble and felt his blood boiling. He hated bullies, and when that bully was an adult, it made him even angrier because kids couldn't fight back easily. He had once seen a teacher do this to a student at an inter-school sports carnival and had felt the same outrage. The teacher in question, one Mr. Darrell, had not belonged to Vivian's school and was therefore beyond the immediate reach of his gang. But Vivian remembered the name of the school, Hartington Primary, and the teacher. He had then reached out that evening, using many contacts on social media, to identify his counterpart at Hartington Primary, a boy named Troy Miller, who was in Mr. Darrell's class. A few boxes of Vivian's Pop-Pops had changed hands, and the following day, Mr. Darrell had returned to the teacher's parking bay to find his brand new ute slumped on flattened tires riddled with nails. The way Vivian saw it, if kids had to follow the rules, and so did adults, and Mr. Mallory was not doing that. "Hey, I wouldn't look down on rabbits too much," he said loudly, ignoring Token's warning glare. "They've got strong teeth, they can chew through anything, escape anything. And as for pigs," he added, meeting Tank's eyes, "I've heard they can eat anything, even people." Vivian saw two things before the pain began. First, he saw Tank's eyes stop fluttering and widen in horror at what he had just said. The second was Mallory's grin, which changed from malicious to bestial. The groundskeeper swung his arm. There was a hard jolt, a flashbulb behind Vivian's eyelids, and a disorientating bloom of incredible pain in his jaw which spread out through his head like a mushroom cloud. His head shot sideways onto his shoulder, and the world spun. The ground came up into his face, and his body collapsed over it like a train coming off its tracks. Somewhere in a distant compartment of his brain, Vivian knew what had just happened, and he had to get control. However, as he lay there, the smell of grass in his nose, lips swelling like a blister, and his mouth filling what appeared to be hot, salty soup, Vivian realized he had lost control of himself. His face grew hot, and he felt tears welling. A moan grew in his throat, but he choked it out, swallowing some soup in the process. "No such thing as brave rabbits, only skinned ones," Mallory chuckled, standing over him. "Tomorrow you work in Mallory's fields. And tomorrow you learn to be a good rabbit, eh?" "Don't hold your breath," Vivian managed between gasps and sobs, glad that his fringe covered most of his wet cheeks. Mallory threw his head back and laughed, a horrid wet sound. Off you go there, noisy rabbit. Sun is high now, planting is done today. He waved the boys away with an air of disinterest. Follow of the rabbits back to the hole. We meet again tomorrow. He turned and strode toward his shack with a gate so wide that he looked like a spider picking its way over a web. Vivian wiped his mouth with the back of a shaking hand and stared at the strawberry smear it left. Pain came in icy waves which rolled down his jaw like the reverberations of a gong. Token stood several feet away, staring at him with a cold expression. You crazy or something? Wasn't going to let you have all the fun. Vivian spat out a bloody gob. He tried to sit up, but the aching in his jaw made him feel dizzy. I told you, the wardens aren't like teachers. Token shook his head. And Mallory doesn't do the old back and forth. Vivian spat out another gob. Better than being a coward. Better being a coward than a fool. Token shook his head. Fools get other people into trouble. That's why we don't run with them. The remark stung Vivian as much as his busted lip. He suddenly felt embarrassed and needing to justify his actions. So I suppose you think it's smart to let him do that to you? Or Tiny over there? He forced the words out between sobs that he desperately wished he could hold back. I didn't need your help, Cobweb, Tank bellowed, so loud that it echoed off the field. The big boy wiped his nose with the back of his hand. Vivian saw his face was still flushed, but his eyes were focused and vicious again. He turned and started trudging up toward the slope in the direction of the house. And carry your own goddamn bag! Standing nearby, Lewis looked over at Vivian with an expression of uncertainty. Vivian hoped that he would lighten the situation with a joke or sarcastic comment, but the boy simply shook his head, slid his hands into his pockets, and followed Tank. Hanging his head, Vivian sat between his splayed legs, fighting to get his sobbing breaths under control. His jaw may have felt like it was hanging by a hinge, but it was his pride that hurt more. He felt all of his hard-earned reputation melting away around him like a pool of warm ice cream. Looking past Token, he saw that the kids in the field had gathered up their tools and sacks and were making their way along the rows toward the shack. Every one of them was throwing glances his way, and he knew they had seen what had happened. They had seen how easily he had been knocked down, and Vivian suspected that for the rest of the day they would be talking about only that. Everything had gone wrong in one moment, and he felt hot tears of frustration trying to burst forth. Don't be feeling too down on yourself, Token said softly as if reading his mind. They think I'm a pushover, Vivian muttered. Right now they don't know what to think, the dark boy replied. Don't worry, I'll smooth things over, he grinned. The way I be telling it, you be smelling like a rose by tea time. Vivian nodded his thanks. Didn't do much good though. Well, Token sighed. I call you a fool, but that don't mean what you tried to do didn't take some guts. Tank owes you, and he knows it. Besides, he pointed with his chin in the direction of the field. Someone else knows it too. Vivian followed his gaze. Leona stood where she was, watching them. Vivian could not see the look on his face because of the tears blurring his vision, but he didn't think that she was scowling anymore. Come on, tough guy, let's go. Token extended his hand. With a grunt, Vivian accepted it and allowed himself to be pulled to his feet. Go easy on Tank, by the way, Token said, sliding a hand through the duffel strap. I know he a big guy with a big temper, and I know you just standing your ground, but give him some respect. Mallory went kidding when he said that he skinned him. Fine. Vivian hooked his hand through the other strap. But what's his problem? His problem, Cobweb, is that he's a kid like the rest of us, Token sighed. And kids get scared.